The smell of burning paper lingered in the cold night air. I stood there, watching the flames curl around the edges of the old letters, turning inked words into blackened remnants. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke away, and with it any trace of sentiment. Love, loyalty, promises meaningless now. My name is Matthew Hewitt. I'm 52 years old. I run a private security firm out of Houston, Texas, and I don't make mistakes when it comes to intelligence gathering. In my line of work, bad intel gets men killed. But somehow in my own home I'd allowed myself to be blind. That was over. Denise had been slipping for months. At first, it was the usual tells, staying late at work, a shift in tone when she spoke to me, the kind of nervous energy a woman carries when she's got a secret. I'd seen it before in a dozen cheating spouses we were hired to tail. The difference now was I wasn't the investigator. I was the fool on the receiving end. I didn't confront her. That's what weak men do. They demand, they plead, they try to reason with a woman who's already checked out. I gathered proof. A camera in the bedroom, discreet and well-placed. Software that mirrored her phone messages straight to mine. The first night, I sat in my office downtown watching a grainy live feed of my wife stripping down in our bedroom. Not for me. For him. Mitchell Kinsey, 38 years old, ran a tattoo shop in the artsy part of town where the rent was high and the clientele paid more for aesthetic than skill. He had that brooding, half-starved look women with too much time on their hands fell for. Arms covered in ink, hair just messy enough to look effortless, spoke in slow, deliberate phrases like he was always on the verge of saying something profound. I had his address within the hour. No surprises, an overpriced loft above his shop, the kind of place a man kept when he had no real roots. I drove by, sat across the street in my truck, watched through the windows as he moved inside. Lived alone. Good. That made things simple. I let the tension settle. Rushed moves got men killed in combat, and they made fools of men in situations like this. Denise thought she was playing me, thought she was sneaking around in the shadows while I went about my days, unaware. That was the first mistake people like her made. They assumed a man like me could be deceived. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, drinking black coffee while she moved around the house, getting ready for work. She avoided my eyes. Another tell. Women never realized how much they gave away when they started lying. You've been working late a lot. My tone was casual. The kind of thing a man says when he's making conversation, not when he's asking questions. She hesitated for half a second. That was all I needed. Yeah, the firm's been swamped. She poured herself a cup, but her hand lingered around the rim. End of the quarter, you know how it is. I nodded, taking another sip. I do. She smiled, relieved that I didn't push. She had no idea how much I already knew. By noon, I was sitting across from Derek Foster at a steakhouse downtown. Derek was a real estate agent, the kind of guy who wore his ambition like a cologne. I found his name in a text thread between Denise and Mitchell. Apparently, she'd been looking at apartments. Derek cut into his sirloin, talking a mile a minute about the Houston market, how property values were surging, how he had a few off-market opportunities he could show me. I let him ramble before setting my knife down and meeting his eyes. You worked with my wife recently, I said. The words were simple. No accusation, no anger. Just a statement. Derek froze for half a second before forcing a smile. Oh, Denise, right? Yeah, she was looking at a few places, just browsing, you know how people are. I didn't blink. Browsing? He cleared his throat, setting his fork down. She didn't sign anything. Just looking at options. Options, I repeated. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He knew. He knew, and he was scrambling to figure out how much I did. I leaned back, tapping my fingers against the table. You're gonna forward me everything you have. Every message, every property inquiry, every little note she left you about what she was looking for. Derek hesitated, then forced another grin. Hey man, I gotta respect client privacy. I didn't move, just stared him down until his smile faded. You work on commission, right? A pause. I tilted my head. Think very carefully about what matters more, her privacy or your paycheck. It took him less than a minute to grab his phone and start forwarding emails. By the time I left the restaurant, I had confirmation. Denise had been planning her exit. Not just some fling, not just a mistake, she was setting up a life without me. I'd spent 20 years giving her security, stability, and now she was slinking off into the night with a third-rate tattoo artist and some fantasy about romance. I drove back to my office, parked in the underground garage, and sat in the silence of my truck for a moment. I felt nothing. No heartbreak, no sadness, just clarity. This wasn't about love. It was about power, and I wasn't about to lose. That night, I sat in my office, the glow of the monitors casting cold light across the room. The security feeds ran in the background, my house, my office, my private properties. The world had a way of making men think they were safe. I never made that mistake. Denise's texts kept rolling in. She was careful, deleting threads, using vague language, but I had everything mirrored. Every half-assed excuse, every little "I miss you" she sent to Mitchell. Every time she said she felt alive with him. It wasn't the words that got to me. It was the stupidity. She thought she was in some kind of novel, a tragic heroine trapped in a life she built herself. She had no idea she was about to be a cautionary tale. Mitchell was a pattern. He wasn't her first itch to scratch. The difference was, this time she wasn't just playing. She was planning. She wanted a life beyond me, and for that, she needed to leave clean. Which meant, at some point, she'd come for the money. The mistake women like Denise made was thinking men like me were just gonna roll over and let it happen. I pulled up the financials, tracked her credit card use. A hotel downtown. Twice in the last month. I booked the same room for the next night under an alias. The cameras were already in place. The hotel had subcontracted security through my firm years ago. Their system was my system. I'd have eyes everywhere. The next morning, she was in the kitchen again, same routine. The kids had left for school, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of whatever lie she was about to tell. "You're not working late tonight," I said, watching her over my coffee. Her back stiffened for half a second before she turned, smiling like she wasn't lying to my face. "No, just meeting up with some old friends. Girls' night." I nodded slowly. "That right? Yeah. You know how it is, we never get to catch up anymore." I didn't respond. Just let the silence stretch. She shifted on her feet. Women like Denise weren't used to silence. They needed noise, reassurance, a man who filled the gaps so they could keep pretending. "Well," she said, her voice too bright, "don't work too late." She kissed my cheek like she hadn't just planned to betray me. Then she left. That night, I was at the hotel before her. The cameras picked her up in the lobby at 7:42 p.m. She was careful, checking her surroundings before stepping into the elevator. Her dark hair tucked under a scarf. The little details amused me, like she really believed wearing different lipstick and a vintage dress would make her unrecognizable. Mitchell arrived at 8:10, walking in like a man who thought he'd won. He had that lazy confidence, the kind a man has when he's never actually been tested. I watched him from the corner of the bar, sipping whiskey while he waited for the elevator. He had no idea I was there, no idea he was already being dismantled piece by piece. I could have ended it right then. Walked across the room, crushed his windpipe before he had a chance to react. But that wasn't how this worked. You don't destroy a man by breaking his body. You do it by taking apart everything he thinks he's built. By 8:15 I had everything I needed. Footage of them together in the hotel room, a perfect little time-stamped record of their betrayal. I could have left, but I waited. I wanted to see how they acted when they thought no one was watching. Denise had that nervous energy, pacing, running her hands through her hair like she was carrying some deep emotional burden. Mitchell sat on the edge of the bed, looking up at her like he was something special. He wasn't. He was a placeholder, a distraction, a thing to make her feel young and wanted and all the other bullshit women like her chase when they start looking for a way out. She leaned down, touched his face, whispered something. He smiled, murmured back. I turned off the feed. I didn't need to hear it. By morning, everything was in motion. I met with my lawyer, finalized the divorce papers, and compiled the evidence. Legally, I had her cornered. Texas was an at-fault state, and infidelity carried weight. She wouldn't get a damn dime beyond what I allowed. The real estate agent, Derek, called around noon. His voice was tight, nervous. "Hey man, just following up. You asked for everything, and I sent it, so." "You worried about something, Derek?" No, just making sure we're good." I let him stew in the silence. "We're good," I said finally. "Long as you don't grow a conscience." "Nah, man. Not my business." "That's right," I said. "It's not." By evening, I had the final piece in place. Denise's parents. Old school, traditional. They thought the world of me. More importantly, they were the kind of people who believed in consequences. I called her father, Richard, and asked him and his wife to dinner. Didn't tell him why. He said yes because when I called, people didn't say no. The confrontation was set. Denise had no idea she was walking into an ambush. But she would. And she'd remember this night for the rest of her life. I sat in the dining room, rolling my glass between my fingers, listening to the ice shift. The air was thick with the smell of grilled steak, but nobody was eating. Denise's parents sat across from me, Richard with his stiff posture, his wife, Carol, already sensing something was off. Denise was late. Richard cleared his throat. She said she'd be here at 7? I glanced at my watch. 7:23, she's on her way. Carol gave a tight smile. She's probably just caught in traffic. I didn't answer. I knew exactly where she was. The security feed on my phone showed her pulling out of Mitchell's building 15 minutes ago. The way she adjusted her hair in the mirror, reapplied lipstick. Like she could wipe the stain off herself before walking through the door. Footsteps on the porch. The door opened. Denise stepped in, keys jingling in her hand, still breathless from the rush. Her eyes flicked over the table, landing on her parents first, then on me. She hesitated just long enough for me to know she'd felt it. That shift in the air, the unspoken weight pressing in. "You're late," I said. She forced a smile, sliding into her chair. "Yeah, sorry. Work ran late." Richard nodded like he believed it. Carol reached for her wine, trying to smooth over whatever she thought was happening. I set my glass down, folded my hands. "Let's not waste time." Denise's smile faltered. "What?" I pulled the manila folder from the chair beside me, slid it across the table. She stared at it like it might bite her. "What is this?" "Open it." Her fingers trembled when she reached for it, her throat working as she flipped it open. The color drained from her face. Inside was everything. The hotel records. The texts. The photos from the surveillance feed. Undeniable, time-stamped proof of exactly where she'd been, who she'd been with, and for how long. Carol's breath hitched. Richard's expression hardened, his eyes fixed on the evidence like he was still processing what he was seeing. Denise swallowed hard. Matt, this isn't." "Don't." My voice was steady, calm. "Don't insult me. Don't insult them." I nodded toward her parents, who sat frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in. Her hands curled into fists. "This isn't fair." I exhaled slowly. "Fair?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice even. "Fair is me making sure you don't take a cent from me. Fair is me making sure you don't turn this into some sob story where you're the victim. Fair is you owning what you did and living with the consequences." She blinked fast, her breath coming in sharp little gasps like she was trying to keep herself together. Carol covered her mouth. "Denise, tell me this isn't true." Denise's lips parted, but nothing came out. Richard closed the folder, jaw tight, hands flexing like he was holding back something bigger than words. He turned his gaze on her, and for the first time in years I saw something that looked like disappointment cut through his usual stoic exterior. "I don't recognize you," he muttered. Her head jerked up. "Dad, you did this to yourself." His voice was steady. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. "You had a family, a home, a man who worked his ass off for you, and you threw it away for what? Some damn tattoo artist?" She winced like he'd hit her. "It's not like that." Richard shook his head, pushing back from the table. "No. It's exactly like that." Carol's eyes were wet. "Denise, how could you?" Denise clenched her jaw, her breath coming fast now, her eyes darting between them and me like she was looking for an escape route. She wouldn't find one. I stood, smoothing my hands down my shirt. "Divorce papers are in the folder. My lawyer's number is there. You sign, you get a settlement I decide on. You fight, you get nothing, and we go public." Her head snapped toward me. "Public?" I tilted my head. "You really think I won't?" Her whole body trembled now, her face pale. She knew what that meant. Her parents' social circles. The community she loved playing perfect wife in. The people who thought she had it all together. That image was the only thing she had left, and I was holding the match. Richard pulled his napkin from his lap, tossed it on the table. "I can't look at you right now." He turned to me, eyes hard. "You don't owe her a damn thing." Carol wiped at her face, shaking her head. "Oh, Denise." Denise was shaking, fingers gripping the edge of the table like she might fall over if she let go. "I never meant." I scoffed. "You never meant to get caught." Silence. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She knew better than that. I walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back. "You made your choice. Now you live with it." I left her there with her parents and her shame and didn't look back. The air outside was cooler than before, the wind shifting just enough to carry the scent of rain. I stepped off the porch, my boots hitting the gravel with slow, deliberate steps. Inside, I knew Denise was still sitting at that table, still feeling the weight of what had just happened. Her parents wouldn't comfort her. Not after that. I got in my truck, started the engine, and let the sound drown out whatever last-ditch arguments she was probably trying to make. I didn't need to hear it. I'd already won. The phone buzzed against the console. A text from my lawyer. Paperwork is prepped. She fights, we bury her. I sent back a single thumbs up and pulled onto the road. I wasn't worried about a fight. Denise wasn't a warrior. She was a woman who liked the idea of risk, of breaking the rules, but not the part where she had to deal with consequences. I'd watched enough weak men crumble under pressure to know the signs, and she was no different. 15 minutes later, I pulled into a small strip mall on the other side of town. Mitchell's shop sat between a boutique fitness studio and a smoothie bar, the kind of place that catered to 20-somethings with money to waste. A couple of college kids stood outside smoking, glancing up at me as I stepped out of the truck. They knew better than to say anything. Inside, the place smelled like ink and cheap air freshener. A girl with pink hair sat at the counter, scrolling on her phone, barely looking up. "You got an appointment?" she asked, voice bored. "No," I said, scanning the back of the shop. A curtain separated the front from the workstations. "I'm here for Mitchell." She blinked at me, then looked over her shoulder. "Hey, boss." Footsteps. Mitchell appeared from behind the curtain, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes met mine, and I saw the moment recognition hit. His shoulders stiffened just enough to be noticeable. "I know you?" he asked, trying for casual. I took a step closer, just enough to make the space uncomfortable. "You do now." His fingers curled around the rag, grip tightening. "Look, man, if this is about Denise." "It is." The girl at the counter shifted uncomfortably. Mitchell glanced at her. "Give us a minute." She hesitated, then grabbed her purse and stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind her. Mitchell turned back to me. "I don't want any trouble." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "That's unfortunate." He swallowed hard, trying to maintain eye contact. "Look, man, I didn't force her into anything. She came to me." "I know. She told me she was unhappy. That you weren't, that you didn't." I moved fast, closing the distance between us before he could finish whatever excuse he thought would save him. My hand clamped around his throat, pressing just enough to make him panic but not enough to end the conversation. His eyes went wide, hands coming up instinctively. "You think I give a damn what she told you?" My voice was low, steady. "You think you matter?" He tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled sound. I eased the pressure just enough to let him breathe. "You're nothing, Mitchell. A side piece. A distraction. A mistake she made when she got bored." I leaned in slightly. "And now she's drowning, and you? You're the dead weight dragging her down." His breath came fast, panicked. I could feel his pulse under my fingers, the raw terror settling in. He wasn't built for this. Men like him thought words were power. They didn't understand what real power was until they were staring it in the face. I let go, and he stumbled back against the counter, coughing. "You're done," I said. "You stay away from her, or next time, we don't have a conversation." He nodded fast, eyes darting toward the door like he was calculating how quickly he could get out. I took a step back, adjusted my sleeves. "Good talk." Then I walked out, leaving him gasping in his own shop, his hands shaking like a man who had just come face to face with something he'd never wanted to understand. I didn't look back as I left the shop. Mitchell wouldn't be a problem anymore. He'd spend the next few weeks jumping at shadows, waiting for something worse to come. That was enough. Some men you beat down, some men you let their own fear do the work for you. He was the latter. The drive home was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the distant roll of thunder on the horizon. Rain was coming. Fitting. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light. Denise's car was still gone. Maybe she was at a friend's, trying to scrape together some sympathy. Maybe she was just driving, trying to figure out how the hell she ended up here. Didn't matter. She had no moves left. Inside, I went straight to my office. The divorce paperwork was right where I left it. Her copies, waiting for her signature. I flipped through the pages again. Not because I needed to, but because I liked knowing every detail was exactly how I wanted it. No loopholes, no leverage, no room for her to take one more thing from me. A knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I checked the time, just past 10. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see Richard standing there. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in one night, jaw tight, hands shoved into the pockets of his old brown jacket. "Got a minute?" I stepped back. "Yeah." He walked in, slow and deliberate, scanning the room like he was trying to get a read on what kind of man I was now. I shut the door behind him and leaned against the desk. waiting. He exhaled hard, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know what to say to you. Then don't say anything. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Always straight to the point. He met my eyes. I didn't see it coming. I thought I raised her better. I didn't respond. That was his burden, not mine. He sat in the chair across from me, elbows on his knees. Carol hasn't stopped crying since we got home. She's broken over this. He shook his head. Hell, so am I. I stayed silent. I wasn't about to play counselor. His eyes landed on the paperwork sitting on the desk. She hasn't signed? Not yet. She will, he said. Not a question. A fact. I nodded. She doesn't have a choice. He looked down at his hands. I don't expect you to forgive her. Hell, I don't know if I ever will either. He let out a slow breath. But she's still my daughter. I didn't say anything to that. He met my eyes again. I won't ask you to go easy on her. She made her bed. She's got a lie in it. He shifted like the next part was harder to say. But the kids, they're caught in the middle of this. No matter what she did, they still need their mother. I let that sit for a moment. He wasn't wrong. But need and deserve weren't the same thing. I'll do what's right for them, I said. Not for her. He nodded, as if that was the best he could hope for. He stood up, adjusted his jacket. You ever need anything? I didn't let him finish. I won't. He gave me a long look, then nodded once and walked out. When the door shut, I sat back in my chair, staring at the divorce papers. It would be done soon. Denise would be out of my house, out of my name. And then, for the first time in a long time, I'd have nothing left to clean up. Denise signed the papers 2 days later. She didn't try to negotiate, didn't argue. She walked into my office with the same dead look in her eyes she'd had when I left her at the table with her parents. Signed where she needed to sign, and left without a word. She took a suitcase, some clothes, whatever she could fit in the back of her car. She didn't take the kids. She knew she couldn't fight me for them. I didn't even have to say it. She knew she'd lose. They stayed with me. I stood in the doorway watching her back down the driveway. She didn't look at me. I waited until the taillights disappeared before closing the door. That was it. Years gone just like that. No grand finale, no screaming, no dramatic parting words. Just signatures on a piece of paper and an empty space in the closet where her things used to be. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and poured a drink. Not to mourn, to mark the moment. Some men drink to forget. I drink to remember. The kids got home from school an hour later. My son, Jake, didn't ask where she was. He already knew. He was 16, old enough to see the cracks before they broke. My daughter, Heidi, 12, tried to act like it didn't bother her. She sat at the kitchen table, eating her dinner in silence, but her eyes stayed on me, watching for any sign of weakness. I didn't give her one. After dinner, I sat on the porch with Jake, watching the sun dip behind the trees. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. She call you? I asked. He shook his head. Not yet. She will. Yeah. He hesitated. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I looked at him. Whatever you want. He let out a slow breath, nodding. It's weird. What is? He shrugged. Knowing she's just not here. I thought it'd be different. I watched him, waiting. He picked at the thread again. Like I thought I'd be pissed. Or sad. Or something. But I don't feel anything. I nodded. That'll come later. He frowned. What if it doesn't? Then it doesn't. I took a sip of my drink. Not everything needs a reaction. He sat with that for a moment, then nodded like he understood something he hadn't before. Heidi came out a few minutes later, curling up in the chair next to me, pulling her knees to her chest. She didn't say anything, just sat there, staring at the horizon. I didn't push her. We stayed there until the sky went dark, the three of us sitting in the quiet. A new kind of silence. The kind that didn't carry the weight of something waiting to break. A week later, I took them up to the cabin. 40 acres of land, deep in the woods, no neighbors for miles. I'd bought it years ago, back when I thought having a place to escape to was a luxury. Now it was a necessity. The first night, we built a fire in the pit outside. Jake and I split the wood, Heidi stacked it. The stars were clearer up here, the air sharper. No traffic, no noise except for the crackling logs and the occasional hoot of an owl in the trees. Heidi poked at the fire with a stick. Do you think she's okay? I stared at the flames. She's got a roof over her head and a car to drive. She'll be fine. That's not what I meant. I looked at her. She was too smart for her own good. Always had been. She made her choices, I said. She lives with them now. She bit her lip, nodding. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't. She was learning when to let things be. A voice came from the tree line. Hell of a fire you got there. I turned. A woman stepped out of the dark, a rifle slung over her shoulder. Tall, lean, mid-40s, wearing a ranger uniform. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, sharp eyes that didn't miss much. I stood, dusting off my jeans. Didn't realize we had company out here. She smirked. We don't. Closest neighbors a few miles out. But I do patrols through this area. Make sure no idiots are setting the woods on fire. I gestured at the pit. Looks contained to me. She nodded, stepping closer. Good. Not everyone up here knows what the hell they're doing. She shifted her rifle. You Hewitt. I narrowed my eyes slightly. That depends. She let out a short laugh. Relax. I just recognized the name. Your wife, ex-wife, used to come up here. Jake and Heidi both looked at me. I kept my expression even. That right? She nodded, watching me carefully. Saw her a few times meeting someone in town. Guy had tattoos, looked like he belonged in a grunge band. Jake let out a breath, shaking his head. Heidi just stared at the fire. I met the ranger's eyes. You see a lot of things out here, don't you? She shrugged. People forget they're being watched when they think no one's around. I nodded. I appreciate the information. She gave me a look that said she knew I already had all the information I needed. Enjoy your stay. She walked back into the trees, disappearing into the dark. Heidi poked at the fire again. Guess she really didn't care who saw. Jake snorted. Guess not. I sat back down, watching the fire burn. It didn't matter anymore. Denise was just another ghost now, a bad decision that wasn't my problem anymore. Tomorrow we go hunting. Heidi wanted to learn to shoot and Jake needed to start acting like a man. The past was done. The only thing left was forward. The morning air was crisp, the kind that settled deep in your lungs and reminded you that you were alive. The three of us moved through the trees, Jake carrying the rifle, Heidi walking just behind, watching how I moved, how I tracked. She was a fast learner. Jake still hesitated sometimes, overthinking his steps, but that would change. The woods had a way of stripping things down, forcing you to either adapt or get left behind. We came across a clearing, a fresh set of tracks cutting through the dirt. I crouched, running a hand over the indentations. Buck, I said. Big one. Jake adjusted his grip on the rifle, nodding. Heidi stepped closer, eyes sharp. You take point, I told Jake. We're downwind. Move slow, keep your breath steady. He nodded, stepping forward. His hands were steady now, his movements more confident than they had been last time we came up here. Good. An hour later, we had our kill. Jake made a clean shot right through the heart. He didn't celebrate, didn't puff his chest like some cocky kid. Just nodded, took a breath, and set to work dressing it the way I'd taught him. Heidi watched, taking mental notes, already asking what she'd need to do when it was her turn. We hauled the meat back to the cabin, cleaned up, and set some aside to cook. The rest would be packed and taken home. I let them handle most of it, stepping in when needed, but mostly letting them figure it out. They were stronger than they thought. That night, we sat around the fire again, this time with full plates. The taste of real work, real effort. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Heidi picked at her food, thinking. She looked at me. Do you ever miss her? Jake exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Why would he? Heidi shrugged. She was still her mom. I chewed my food, let the words sit there. The fire cracked, sending embers floating into the air. People show you who they are, I said finally. You just have to believe them. She nodded, looking into the flames. Jake scoffed. Bet Mitchell doesn't feel so deep in love now. I smirked. No. He doesn't. I didn't have to check. I already knew what had happened. Mitchell had shut down his shop a week after our little talk. Probably told himself it was a fresh start, but I knew better. He wasn't built for this kind of attention, this kind of pressure. He left town, tail tucked, just another ghost in the long list of men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Denise had moved into some small rental on the other side of town, far from her old life. Word got out about the affair. Friends she thought would stand by her didn't return her calls. The women who used to invite her for brunch kept their distance. Richard and Carol stopped speaking to her altogether. She'd made her choice. Now she was living in it. I took another bite, let the silence stretch. Heidi broke it first. So what now? I glanced at her. She gestured around. We just keep going? That's how it works, I said. Something knocks you down, you get back up. You keep moving. Jake nodded. No point looking back. None, I agreed. We finished eating. Cleaned up. Went inside. That was it. No dramatic endings. No grand realizations. Just three people who had walked through fire and came out sharper on the other side. Tomorrow would come. And we'd be ready.